My mother slammed the folder onto the dining table so hard the water glasses rattled and tipped, sending drops across the white tablecloth. "Say it," she snapped, her voice cutting through the low hum of conversation that had been filling the room just seconds before. "Tell everyone here what you did to this family." My father stood beside her with his arms crossed tight across his chest, already shaking his head slowly like a judge who'd heard all the evidence and reached his verdict before the trial even started. Around the table, 15 relatives stared at me with expressions ranging from confusion to suspicion to something that looked uncomfortably like agreement. No one spoke up to question what was happening. No one asked why bank statements and financial documents were suddenly being waved around like weapons at what was supposed to be a casual Sunday dinner. No one demanded context or explanation or even basic fairness. They'd already decided I was guilty. I could see it in their faces, in the way they leaned back in their chairs and crossed their own arms, in the way they avoided making direct eye contact with me. The verdict had been delivered before I even knew there was a trial. My face burned hot as my father finally looked directly at me for the first time since I'd arrived at their house that afternoon. "You ruined this family," he said, his voice unnaturally calm and measured, each word delivered with careful precision like he'd rehearsed this speech multiple times before performing it. "Every single dollar we've lost over the past year traces directly back to you and your choices." The calmness in his tone hurt worse than any shouting would have. Shouting would have meant emotion, passion, anger born from pain. But this controlled, deliberate delivery meant something else entirely. It meant he'd planned this moment. It meant he'd thought through exactly how he wanted to present this accusation, exactly what effect he wanted it to have on everyone watching. He wanted witnesses to this. He wanted an audience to validate his version of events, to nod along and agree that I was the source of their problems. He wanted public confirmation that he was right and I was wrong, that he was the victim and I was the villain. And he'd waited until everyone was gathered, seated, trapped at a table, before launching his attack. One thought drowned out everything else happening in that suddenly silent dining room. One realization cut through the shock and the burning embarrassment and the confusion swirling in my head. My parents were blaming me for the family's financial collapse. Not privately, in some quiet conversation where we could discuss facts and review records and try to understand what had actually happened. Not carefully, with concern for my feelings or interest in my perspective. Here. Right here, in front of my aunts and uncles and cousins, in front of people who would remember this moment and repeat this story and form opinions that might never change regardless of what truth eventually emerged. They were publicly accusing me of destroying their financial stability, of being responsible for whatever money troubles they were facing. And sitting there with everyone's eyes on me, with my mother's hand still pressed flat against that folder like she was holding down proof of my crimes, I realized something that made my stomach twist. I didn't even know what evidence they were claiming to have. I didn't know what numbers they were looking at or what timeline they'd constructed or what story they'd built that somehow made me the villain. My name is Brittany Clark. I'm 26 years old. And in that moment, watching my parents present their case against me to a jury of relatives who seemed ready to convict without hearing my defense, I realized something terrifying. They weren't confused about what had happened. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with conversation and documentation. This wasn't them jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information that I could fill in and correct. They weren't operating from a place of uncertainty or doubt. No, sitting there looking at the determination in their expressions, the careful staging of this confrontation, the prepared nature of their accusations, I understood something that changed everything. They were committed to this narrative. They had decided, for whatever reason, that I was responsible for their financial problems. And they had chosen to make that decision public and permanent. Whether they actually believed it or whether they simply needed someone to blame, I couldn't tell yet. But either way, they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd made an accusation in front of witnesses that couldn't be taken back or quietly forgotten. Growing up in the Clark household, money was never discussed honestly or openly. It was this shadowy presence that influenced every decision but was never explained or examined. We had it, then we didn't, then we did again, and no one ever talked about why the changes happened or what they meant. Asking questions about finances meant you were being disrespectful, prying into adult matters that weren't your concern. Staying silent and accepting whatever you were told without pushing for details meant you were being loyal, trustworthy, a good daughter who understood her place in the family hierarchy. I learned early to stop asking where money came from or where it went, to stop wondering why some months we ate out constantly and other months we had frozen dinners, to stop trying to understand the pattern because there was no pattern I was allowed to see. My parents controlled information the way some people control temperature in a house, adjusting it constantly to maintain their comfort without explaining why it needed to change. And I was always expected to be loyal above everything else. Loyal meant silent. Loyal meant accepting. Loyal meant never questioning their decisions or their explanations. In our family, some expenses were called investments in the future, and were discussed with pride and excitement. Others were called burdens we have to carry, and were mentioned with sighs and complaints and barely concealed resentment. My brother's college tuition was an investment. My community college classes were a burden. His car was an investment in his independence. My bus pass was an expense we couldn't really afford. His apartment security deposit was helping him build adult skills. My rent, when I briefly lived away from home, was me being selfish and not thinking about family needs. The pattern was obvious if you paid attention, which I did constantly, trying to understand the rules that governed how love and money intersected in our house. Guess which category had my name attached most frequently? Guess whose needs were expendable when budgets got tight? Guess who heard over and over about sacrifices being made and costs being absorbed and how expensive it was to support me? This favoritism in how expenses were framed, how money was allocated, how financial decisions were explained, it wasn't new. It had been there my whole life. I just hadn't realized it would eventually be weaponized against me. Back at that dining table, with everyone still staring and waiting for my response, my mother opened the folder and started listing sacrifices they'd made, because of me, over the years. Each item was delivered with theatrical pain, with sighs and pauses that invited sympathy from the audience surrounding us. But as I really listened to what she was saying, I noticed something crucial. None of these sacrifices had specific dates attached. None of them had documentation or proof or even basic details that could be verified. She mentioned helping me with rent, but didn't say when or how much. She talked about covering my car insurance, but didn't specify which months or what the actual cost had been. She referenced money borrowed that was never paid back, but couldn't name the amount or the date of the loan. Everything was vague, emotional, designed to create an impression rather than present facts. It was a performance of victimhood, carefully constructed to generate sympathy and agreement from people who had no way to verify if any of it was actually true. Just emotion, delivered with conviction, filling the silence with accusations that had no substance. I didn't interrupt while my mother spoke. I didn't cry or argue or try to defend myself against accusations that kept shifting and expanding with each sentence. I just let them talk, let them present their case, let them fill the room with their version of events while I sat still and quiet and watchful. My father frowned at my silence. I could see confusion flickering across his face, quickly replaced by what looked like frustration. He'd expected resistance. He'd expected me to get emotional, to break down or lash out, to give him ammunition for his narrative about me being difficult or unstable or irresponsible. He'd staged this whole confrontation in front of witnesses because he wanted them to see me lose control, to watch me react in ways that would confirm his story about who I was. But I didn't give him that satisfaction. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, my expression neutral, my breathing steady despite the way my heart was hammering in my chest. I listened to every word. I noted every claim. And I stayed silent, letting their accusations hang in the air without my emotional response to validate or energize them. Then my mother mentioned something specific that made my brain immediately snap to attention. "The loan we had to take out after you moved back home," she said, shaking her head with exaggerated disappointment. "We went into debt because we couldn't say no to our own daughter." The words landed in the quiet room with weight, with a ring of concrete evidence rather than vague emotional claims. Relatives nodded sympathetically. Someone murmured something about how hard it must have been. But sitting there, mentally reviewing my own timeline, my own history, I felt something click into place. I hadn't lived at their house at the point she was describing. I'd been living in my own apartment across town, working full-time, paying my own bills. The dates didn't match. She was talking about a period when I wasn't even there, attributing financial decisions to my presence when I'd been completely independent and separate from their household. It was a small detail, easy to miss if you weren't paying close attention to timeline and sequence. But I noticed, and noticing that one inconsistency made me start questioning everything else they'd said. If that detail was wrong, what else was wrong? What else had been adjusted or invented to support their narrative? That night, alone in my apartment, I replayed every sentence, every accusation, every specific claim they'd made during that terrible dinner. My chest felt physically tight, like someone had wrapped bands around my ribs and was slowly squeezing. But despite the anxiety, despite the humiliation still burning in my memory, my mind felt unusually sharp and focused. I grabbed a notebook and started writing down everything I could remember them saying. Every amount mentioned, every time period referenced, every specific accusation that had actual details attached rather than just vague emotional content. And as I wrote, as I organized their claims into a list I could examine properly, I started seeing gaps. Things that didn't quite line up. Periods where their timeline contradicted what I knew to be true about my own life. My mother had said they'd helped me with rent for 6 months, but I'd only asked for help twice, 2 specific months when unexpected medical bills had hit. My father had mentioned buying me a car, but I'd bought my own car with money saved from my job. Something didn't add up. The story they were telling wasn't matching the reality I'd actually lived. I made a decision that night, sitting at my small kitchen table with my notebook full of their accusations. I wasn't going to defend myself emotionally. I wasn't going to call them up crying or show up at their house demanding they take it back. I wasn't going to write long messages explaining my feelings or appeal to relatives begging them to hear my side. Because doing any of those things would just be noise, would just be my word against theirs, would just be emotional claims competing with their emotional claims. If they wanted to make this about numbers, about money, about financial responsibility and who caused what problems, then I would meet them on that ground. But I would do it properly, carefully, with documentation and evidence rather than feelings and accusations. I would give them time to keep talking, to keep explaining their version of events to anyone who would listen. And while they talked, I would build a timeline. A real timeline with actual dates and actual proof and actual documentation that could be verified by anyone who wanted to check. Because timelines don't lie. Calendars don't change based on who's telling the story. And mathematics doesn't care about emotion. I started digging through my email history, searching for anything that might help me understand what had actually happened with my parents' finances. And in my archived folder, buried under hundreds of other messages, I found something that made my blood run cold. An email from my father sent to my uncle, dated 15 months earlier. The subject line was, loan approval, investment property. I opened it with shaking hands. The message was brief, professional, thanking my uncle for co-signing some kind of loan related to a rental property my parents had apparently purchased as an investment. The email discussed interest rates and repayment schedules and projected rental income. It was dated months before the period when they claimed I'd moved back home and caused their financial troubles. Months before any of the timeline they'd presented at that dinner. I read it 3 times, checking the date stamp, checking the sender and recipient, making absolutely certain I was understanding this correctly. My name appeared nowhere in that email. Not in the body, not in the subject, not copied or mentioned or referenced in any way. This was a financial decision they'd made completely independent of me, documented in their own words, time-stamped by the email system itself. Once I started looking with purpose, patterns began emerging from documents and messages I'd saved without really thinking about their importance. Bank statements from when I'd briefly had a joint account with my mother for emergency purposes, showing deposits and withdrawals that told a very different story than the one she'd presented at dinner. Comments my father had made in passing over family meals, recorded in text messages to my brother where I'd vented about confusing conversations. Admissions about purchases and investments and financial decisions, casually mentioned and then apparently forgotten by my parents but preserved in digital records that couldn't be altered or denied. They'd forgotten what they'd told me. They'd forgotten the details they'd shared when they thought nothing was at stake, when they were just making conversation rather than building a case. They'd told the truth in small moments, in unguarded comments, in messages and statements that they never imagined would matter later. And all of those small truths collected together contradicted nearly everything they'd said at that family dinner. The timeline they'd presented was built on adjustments and omissions and reframing of events that had actually happened differently. Over the next few days, relatives started repeating my parents' version of events, sharing what they'd been told about my supposed role in the family's financial problems. But as I listened to these second-hand accounts, collected from cousins and family friends who reached out either to condemn me or to ask if I was okay, I noticed something fascinating. The story kept changing slightly with each retelling. One person said I'd borrowed $20,000. Another said it was closer to 40. One relative mentioned a failed business I'd started with my parents' money, which was completely fabricated since I'd never started any business. Another talked about credit cards I'd maxed out in their names, also completely untrue. Some versions had me living at home for 2 years, others said 6 months, still others claimed I'd moved back 3 separate times. None of these variations matched each other. None of them aligned with the timeline my parents had originally presented. And all of them contradicted verifiable facts about my own life. False stories don't stay still. Truth has a consistency, a stability because it's anchored to actual events that happened in actual sequence. But lies shift and adjust with each telling, details changing based on what the current audience might find believable. I cleared my entire kitchen table one evening and laid everything out in physical space where I could see it all at once. Printed bank statements arranged chronologically. Emails organized by date. Text messages screenshotted and printed. Conversation threads laid out in order. Receipts from my own rent payments, proving where I'd been living during specific months. Employment records showing when I'd been working and how much I'd been earning. Loan documents from when I'd financed my car, signed only by me, no parental involvement. Everything arranged into a timeline that stretched across the table, month by month, showing exactly what had been happening in my life and in my parents' financial life during the period they described. The truth was quiet sitting there on my kitchen table. It didn't need dramatic delivery or emotional appeals. It didn't need to be defended or explained or justified. It was just there, documented and dated and verifiable. And it was devastating to my parents' narrative. Because when you laid out the actual timeline, when you put real dates next to real events, the story fell completely apart. I wasn't on it. I wasn't there. My name appeared almost nowhere in the actual financial decisions that had caused their problems. My cousin Stephanie called me 3 days after the disastrous family dinner. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly, her voice careful in a way that made me immediately tense. "I need to understand what actually happened." We met at a coffee shop halfway between our apartments. She arrived with a notebook which surprised me. "I'm not trying to take sides," she said immediately, before I could even order. "But Mom keeps telling me different versions and I can't figure out what's real anymore." I asked her what versions she'd heard. She listed them, and I counted at least 5 major inconsistencies between the stories. Then I asked her one simple question. "When did this actually start? According to what you've been told, when did I supposedly move back home?" She checked her notes. 2 years ago, around October. I pulled out my phone and showed her my lease agreement from that period, signed and dated, proving I'd been living in my own apartment. I showed her employment records confirming where I'd been working. I showed her the email from my father about the investment property loan, dated months before I'd allegedly caused any problems. Her face changed as she scrolled through the documents, her expression shifting from uncertainty to something that looked like betrayal. Not betrayal by me, Betrayal by people she'd believed without questioning. Something shifted in the family dynamics after Stephanie started quietly sharing what she'd learned. My parents began explaining things to people who hadn't even asked questions, calling relatives unprompted to clarify details, sending long text messages elaborating on points that hadn't been disputed. This was new behavior. Previously, they'd just made their accusations and let them stand, confident that their version would be accepted without challenge. But now they were defensive, reactive, responding to questions no one had actually asked yet. My mother called my aunt to explain that when she'd said 2 years, she'd really meant on and off over several years, adjusting the timeline to be less specific and harder to pin down. My father told my uncle that the loan had been partially for helping me, though he couldn't specify which part or how much. They were trying to maintain their narrative while simultaneously making it flexible enough to avoid direct contradiction with verifiable facts. But in doing so, they were revealing something important. They knew their original story had problems. They knew the timeline didn't hold up under examination. And they were panicking. The explanations kept evolving as more people started asking quiet questions. First it was miscommunication, when specific dates got challenged. We might have gotten the timing slightly wrong, but the overall situation is accurate, my mother told someone who'd asked about the move-in date. Then it became about stress, when larger inconsistencies emerged. We were under so much financial pressure we might have confused some details, my father explained to a cousin. Then it shifted to everyone shares some blame, when their own documented decisions started surfacing. It's not fair to say only Brittany contributed to our problems, but she was a significant factor, they told family friends. Each new version contradicted elements of the previous versions. Each adjustment revealed another hole in their original timeline. They were contradicting themselves in real time, in ways that people were starting to notice and compare. When you tell the truth, your story stays consistent because you're just reporting what actually happened. But when you're building a narrative to serve a purpose, especially one that wasn't true to begin with, you have to keep adjusting it as challenges emerge. And each adjustment makes the whole structure weaker. Another relative, my Uncle Vincent, asked to see the documents directly. "I'm not doubting anyone," he said carefully when he called. "I just want to understand the full picture before forming opinions." I invited him to my apartment and showed him everything I'd collected, laid out on my kitchen table in chronological order. I didn't add commentary. I didn't explain or interpret or try to guide his conclusions. I just handed him the timeline and let him read through it himself, following the dates, checking the documentation, seeing what the actual evidence showed. He spent almost an hour going through everything, occasionally asking questions about specific items but mostly just reading and taking notes. When he finished, he sat back in my chair and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "They took out that investment property loan before any of this supposedly started," he said finally. "And it was a lot more money than they told the family it was." He nodded. "Math doesn't argue back," I said quietly. "Dates don't change based on who's telling the story." He promised to look at his own records of conversations with my parents, comparing what they'd said to him versus what they'd said to others. By day 7 after the original confrontation, people had started comparing notes. Stephanie talked to Vincent. Vincent talked to my aunt. My aunt talked to cousins who'd been at the dinner. Each person shared what they'd been told by my parents, and as those stories got laid side by side, the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. In one version I'd lived at home for 2 years. In another 6 months. In a third, on and off over several years. The amount of money I'd supposedly borrowed ranged from $5,000 to $40,000 depending on who was telling it. The timeline of when these financial problems started kept shifting backward and forward, adjusting to accommodate whatever challenge had been raised. People started creating their own written comparisons, texting screenshots of different versions they'd received to each other for verification. And as that comparison happened, as the collective family memory got organized and examined, the timeline my parents had presented collapsed entirely. Not because of any dramatic revelation or smoking gun. Just because when you put all the pieces together and looked at them objectively, The dates didn't work. The numbers didn't add up. The story didn't hold together. And so the certainty people had felt at that family dinner, the confidence in my guilt, began to crack and crumble. My parents stopped bringing up my supposed financial crimes after that first week. No more accusations at family gatherings. No more pointed comments about responsibility and consequences. No more dramatic folder slamming or public condemnations. They just went quiet on the subject, acting like it had never happened, like they'd never stood in front of 15 relatives and blamed me for ruining the family. But the room had already changed. The family dynamic had already shifted. You could feel it at the next gathering, in the way conversations paused when they entered, in the way people avoided certain topics, in the careful distance relatives now kept from their accusations and narratives. Relatives who'd nodded along at that first dinner now gave non-committal responses when my parents tried to bring up financial topics. People who'd seemed ready to condemn me now avoided taking sides or changed the subject. The easy acceptance my parents had counted on, the automatic trust they'd expected, had evaporated. And silence, I realized, isn't the same as repair. Silence isn't acceptance or forgiveness. Sometimes silence is just people choosing not to engage with something they no longer believe. My father sent me a text message on day 9, late at night when he probably thought emotional exhaustion would make me more vulnerable to guilt. "Why are you doing this to us?" it read. "We're your parents. Family is supposed to protect each other, not tear each other down. Whatever you think happened, we can work it out privately instead of spreading stories." I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over, trying to understand the reality it described. In his version, I was the one doing something to them. I was the aggressor, the one attacking, the one spreading stories and causing damage. I hadn't done anything. I hadn't called relatives to defend myself. I hadn't sent group messages sharing my evidence. I hadn't made public accusations or demanded apologies or tried to turn the family against them. I'd simply shown documentation to people who asked to see it, let them draw their own conclusions from actual dates and actual records. The truth was doing this to them, not me. Their own words, their own decisions, their own documented financial choices, all of it preserved in emails and statements they'd created themselves. That was what was destroying their narrative. I was just the person who'd stopped accepting blame for things I hadn't done. By the end of week 2, nobody in the family believed my parents' version of events anymore. Not because I'd argued passionately or appealed emotionally or made dramatic speeches about innocence and justice, but because the dates didn't move. You could feel different ways about what the evidence meant. You could interpret the financial decisions generously or harshly. You could debate whether certain choices had been wise or foolish. But you couldn't change the actual timeline. You couldn't make October become March or make 2019 become 2021. You couldn't make a loan document appear before its actual date or make my lease agreement vanish from the period when I'd been living independently. The mathematics of chronology, the simple factual sequence of when things had happened, that remained constant regardless of how anyone felt about it. And once people saw that timeline clearly, once they understood that my parents' story required events to have happened in an order that contradicted documented reality, belief collapsed. Not because I'd won some argument, but because truth had simply stood still while lies kept moving and eventually fell apart from their own inconsistency. I felt lighter than I had in years, maybe lighter than I'd ever felt in my relationship with my parents. My name was clear. Not because I'd been officially exonerated in some dramatic family trial, but because anyone who cared to look could see that the accusations hadn't been based on reality. My role in the family's financial situation had been restored to what it actually was. Minimal, separate, uninvolved in the decisions that had caused their problems. The weight of undeserved blame that had been crushing down on me since that terrible dinner had lifted. I hadn't realized how much energy it took to carry false guilt until I wasn't carrying it anymore. Could breathe fully. I could sleep through the night without waking up mentally defending myself against imaginary accusations. I could go through my days without that constant background anxiety about what other people believed about my character, my integrity, my responsibility to family. My silence, my refusal to engage emotionally while letting evidence speak factually. had protected me in ways that argument and defensiveness never could have. Because I hadn't given them ammunition to use against me. I hadn't given them examples of me being unstable or emotional or difficult. I'd just been quiet and truthful and patient. They blamed me because it was convenient. Because they needed someone to point to. Someone to hold responsible for financial decisions that had backfired. Someone who could absorb the family's disappointment and judgment so they didn't have to face it themselves. I was convenient because I was already positioned in their minds as less important, less valuable, more expendable than other family members. It made sense in their narrative to make me the villain. But the timeline made it impossible. The dates, the documentation, the simple chronological reality of when events had actually occurred, all of it made their story fall apart under even basic examination. I didn't confront them afterward. Didn't demand public apologies or dramatic reconciliation moments. Didn't try to force them to admit what they'd done or acknowledge the harm they'd caused. I walked away with my integrity intact, with the truth documented and available to anyone who wanted to see it, with my own conscience clear about what had actually happened. And that was what ended the story. Not revenge, not justice, not vindication in some movie-ready way. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that reality had won over narrative, that facts had proved stronger than accusations, and that I'd protected myself by trusting in verifiable truth instead of engaging in emotional battles I could never have won.